My name is Rachel Miller. I am 28 years old, and I thought going to my sister's wedding would just be another reminder that in my family I never belonged. I expected the sideways glances, the empty seat by the fire exit, the way my mother's pearls always seemed to shine brighter when she looked at Emily instead of me. But that night held something more than humiliation. My fiancé leaned close, his voice steady in my ear, and what he whispered made my blood run cold. What if the man my sister was marrying wasn't who everyone thought he was? What if the truth could turn a ballroom filled with roses and champagne into chaos? Stay with me, because what I witnessed that night will make you question how far family pride can blind them and how fast one secret can change everything. I shifted in my chair, trying not to let the draft from the exit door bother me, but it slipped in cold and sharp, settling in my bones. The table felt like a punishment. I watched waiters circle the main floor with trays of champagne, each flute catching the glow of chandeliers, while mine sat empty. The hum of laughter swirled around me, a sound that should have felt like celebration but instead pressed heavy, reminding me of my place. A couple I barely knew slowed near my table, glancing down at my bread plate, then back at me with polite, strained smiles. They moved on without a word. I pressed my lips together and folded my hands in my lap. I had learned years ago how to sit through moments like this without flinching. My mother called it grace. I called it survival. Emily's voice carried across the ballroom, bright and musical, greeting another cluster of guests. She knew how to light up a room without even trying. Her gown was custom, the lace delicate as frost, every bead catching the light, as if the stars themselves had been sewn into her dress. Guests leaned in toward her, captivated, as if her smile held secrets they longed to share. Jason, tall and polished in his tuxedo, looked like the perfect counterpart. They were the storybook pair, the image of a perfect future. I lowered my eyes to the dry bread in front of me. It wasn't about the food. It never was. It was about the message. You don't belong here, Rachel. Not at this table. Not in this story. Not in the family we show the world. Daniel's chair scraped lightly against the carpet as he settled beside me. He wasn't on the seating chart, but he didn't care. He rested his arm against the back of my chair, shielding me from the glances of passing guests. I tried to smile for him, but my throat was too tight. He leaned closer, his voice warm but low. Ignore them. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But ignoring became harder every year. My mother returned to the head table, her pearls gleaming, her hand slipping easily into my father's arm. I watched her laugh at something Robert Langford said, tilting her head the same way Emily did. The resemblance between mother and daughter was striking. I had heard that my whole life. Emily is your mother's image. Emily is the one who takes after her. I wondered if anyone noticed that no one ever said who I took after. The music softened, and the clinking of glasses began as servers prepared for the first round of toasts. Emily's cheeks flushed as guests raised their glasses, her eyes shining. I should have been happy for her. She was my sister. But all I felt was the familiar heaviness of being set aside, the extra chair no one knew where to put. Daniel's hand found mine again, his thumb moving slowly over my knuckles. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He looked at Jason. You don't deserve this. I let out a bitter laugh under my breath. I'm used to it. I'm not talking about the bread, Rachel. His eyes sharpened, focused on the groom. I'm talking about him. My heart stumbled. What about him? Daniel's jaw tightened. Something's off. I studied Jason, then really studied him. He was smiling, shaking hands, whispering with a man in a navy suit I didn't recognize. His phone remained in his hand, thumb brushing over the screen, even as he nodded to the conversation. He looked confident, but not carefree. Calculated. Alert. Do you know him? My voice barely made it past my lips. Daniel didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed locked on Jason like a hawk circling prey. Finally, he spoke low and certain. I know enough. A ripple of unease spread through me, sharper than my mother's mumbled insult, deeper than the sting of being hidden away at this table. I wanted to ask more, to demand an explanation, but the music rose, applause followed, and the crowd's energy swept over the room like a tide I couldn't stop. The bride and groom moved toward the dance floor, their smiles wide, their steps light, the picture of happiness. Around me, chairs shifted, guests leaned forward, cameras lifted. Every detail sparkled with promise. And yet Daniel's hand stayed steady on mine, his body taut beside me as though we were sitting not at a wedding but at the edge of something dangerous. For the first time that night, the humiliation faded into the background. What Daniel had said now pulsed louder than the orchestra. Something isn't right. And as I watched Jason glance over his shoulder twice, scanning the exits with a flicker of unease, I knew Daniel was right. This wasn't just my sister's perfect wedding. This was the beginning of something none of us were ready for. My mind drifted back to the times when I first learned what it meant to be invisible. I was 10 years old, sitting on a park bench in Cambridge, with a birthday hat tilted on my head and a box of cupcakes balanced on my knees. My mother had told me to wait there, that my friends would be arriving soon, that she and Dad had to take Emily to her ballet rehearsal first, but they would be back before the candles were lit. I sat there, watching the sky turn from blue to orange, the frosting melting slightly in the sun, and no one ever came. After an hour, I finally gave up and carried the cupcakes home, each step heavier than the last. When I opened the apartment door, Emily was twirling in the living room, her new tutu, glittering, my mother clapping and praising her. My father sat in his armchair with a glass of scotch, nodding with approval. No one mentioned my birthday. No one asked about the untouched cupcakes. That night, I ate one by myself at the kitchen table while Emily's recital costume hung on the back of a chair like a trophy. It became a pattern, a quiet rhythm of exclusion. When Emily graduated middle school, my parents threw her a garden party with balloons and catered food. A photographer came to take pictures of her in a white dress. The neighbors gathered, and the air buzzed with excitement. When it was my turn 2 years later, my father mixed up the date of my ceremony, and my mother said she was busy with a charity brunch. I walked across the stage in my cap and gown, scanning the crowd for familiar faces, but there were none. Julie's father, my best friend at the time, offered me a ride home. I smiled and said thank you, but the emptiness settled deep, heavier than the gown draped over my shoulders. In high school, the comparisons grew sharper. Emily was crowned homecoming princess, her photo spread across the yearbook, my mother clipping it out and framing it. I had made honor roll, but when I showed my report card, my father said academics were fine, but people remembered beauty. My mother nodded in agreement. Emily basked in the glow of every achievement while I learned to keep my victories quiet, folded away like papers at the bottom of a drawer. One memory cut deeper than most. I was 19, finishing my sophomore year at Boston University, and my grandmother passed away. She had been the only one who noticed me, the only one who remembered my birthday without fail. In her will, she left a small savings account for me. Not much, but enough to help me buy a used car so I could commute to classes and my part-time job. I was stunned and grateful, feeling for the first time like someone had truly seen me. But the moment was stolen quickly. My parents called me into the kitchen, their voices calm but their eyes sharp. Emily needs a car to get to her modeling shoots, they said. She is the one with potential. If you care about the family, you will sign the account over. I remember holding the pen, my fingers trembling, my chest burning with anger, but my father's voice was steady. Family comes first. My mother added softly, "Don't make this difficult." Emily stood behind them, smiling faintly, already holding the car brochures. I signed. And just like that, what little I had was gone. Emily drove off in a shiny silver Honda the next week, posting pictures with captions about how blessed she was, and I caught the bus to work in the rain. That betrayal stayed with me more than the missed birthdays or the empty graduations. It taught me that in my family I was not simply overlooked, I was expendable. Sitting in that ballroom now, years later, the chandelier lights reflecting off champagne glasses, I wasn't offered. I felt the echo of that pen in my hand, the sting of giving up something meant for me. It all wove together, each slight connected like beads on a string, leading to this moment where I sat alone by the exit while my sister floated at the center like a queen. Daniel's hand rested on mine again, warm and steady, pulling me back to the present. His thumb brushed my knuckles as if he sensed the storm in my chest. I forced a small smile, not trusting myself to speak. He didn't push, didn't ask, just kept his eyes on Jason. Emily's laughter rang out high, and delighted as she clinked glasses with a group of guests near the stage. My mother's face glowed with pride, her pearls catching the light, while my father nodded along his silence, once again disguised as approval. No one looked toward the far corner where I sat, and I realized with a sharp clarity that this was not new. This was not an isolated slight or a mistaken seating. It was the story of my life, written again and again, until the ink had dried permanent. I reached for the bread on my plate, held it in my hand, and for a moment I imagined the cupcakes on my knees all those years ago, sweet melting, uneaten. I thought of the bus stop in the rain, the damp ticket clenched in my fist as Emily drove past in her silver car. I thought of every time I had raised my hand only to be overlooked, every effort brushed aside. The truth struck me hard enough to still my breath. This was the pattern, the model, the blueprint of who I was in their eyes. Not the daughter to be celebrated, not the sister to be honored, just the shadow that made their chosen one shine brighter. My chest tightened as the orchestra swelled again, signaling another round of toasts. The crowd rose to their feet, glasses high, the air alive with cheers. I stayed seated, my empty hands folded in my lap, my eyes locked on the glowing couple at the center of it all. And in that stillness, with the sound of 200 voices echoing through the ballroom, I realized the cruelest truth of all. My invisibility was not an accident. It was the design. Daniel's presence beside me was the only thing that made the night bearable. He sat steady and calm, his dark suit pressed perfectly, his tie straight, his posture composed, as if he were meant to be in a room like this. But I knew better. He was not here for champagne and polite applause. He was here because he was mine, and somehow against everything I had grown up believing he had chosen me. I glanced at him as the guests raised their glasses again. His expression was controlled, almost detached, but his hand still covered mine as if to anchor me. I thought back to the months leading up to this wedding, how often his phone had buzzed with numbers. I didn't recognize how he had stepped outside into the cold night air to take calls in hushed tones. When I asked where he was going, he always smiled faintly and said, "Work, nothing to worry about. Work." That single word had become a wall between us. I knew he worked for the government, something in law enforcement, though he never told me details. The secrecy both unsettled and intrigued me. I was just a marketing associate at a software firm in downtown Boston. I spent my days drafting proposals, scheduling meetings, and wondering if anyone noticed my ideas. Daniel lived in a world of coded calls, late-night briefings, and a calm confidence that suggested he knew more than anyone else in the room. Sometimes I wondered why a man like him had chosen me, a woman so ordinary that even her own family dismissed her. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling of our apartment, listening to the city traffic below. He would return past midnight, his shoulders tense, his phone still glowing. I would ask if he was safe, if it was dangerous, and he would press a kiss to my forehead and murmur that everything was fine. I wanted to believe him, but a quiet fear always lingered that one day he would leave and not come back. As I sat there in the ballroom, his profile outlined by the golden glow of chandeliers, I realized I had accepted his silence because it was the only place where I felt chosen. With him, I wasn't a shadow. I was Rachel, someone worth holding, someone worth protecting. He shifted slightly in his chair, and I noticed his eyes weren't on Emily or the champagne toasts. They were locked on Jason Langford. There was a sharpness in his gaze that made my skin prickle. He wasn't looking at a groom. He was assessing a threat. Jason stood near the stage arm, draped around Emily, his smile wide for the guests who circled him. He looked every bit the polished businessman, the heir to a respected construction family. But I noticed what Daniel saw too. His jaw clenched too often, his eyes moved too quickly, scanning the room, the exits, the faces. He laughed a second late, nodded too quickly as if rehearsed. Daniel's hand tightened on mine. I followed his gaze again and felt the shift in the air. For the first time, I wondered if Emily had any idea who she was marrying or if my parents were too dazzled by the Langford name to care. I leaned slightly toward Daniel. "You're staring." His jaw flexed. "I know." I waited for him to say more, but he didn't. The music swelled again and a waiter passed by offering champagne. The tray never stopped at our table. I glanced at the bubbles rising in the glasses and felt that old sting of exclusion, but it faded quickly under the weight of Daniel's silence. Earlier that week I had caught him at our apartment, standing by the window phone, pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. I heard fragments, surveillance, movement, international. When he realized I was listening, he ended the call quickly and told me not to worry. He had pulled me close, then his arms strong, his voice steady, telling me I was safe. I wanted to press him for answers, but I didn't. My whole life I had learned that pressing for answers never brought me closer to the truth. It only widened the distance. Now, sitting in this ballroom with the sound of laughter and music surrounding us, I realized that whatever he had been hiding in those late-night calls was standing 20 feet away in a tuxedo, smiling for photographs. Emily's veil trailed behind her as she leaned into Jason, her hand resting on his chest. She looked blissful, radiant, certain she was stepping into a perfect life. My mother dabbed at her eyes, my father nodded with quiet approval, and the Langfords soaked in the admiration of Boston's elite. And yet Daniel's eyes never left Jason, sharp and unwavering. I whispered his name, hoping to break the intensity. He didn't look at me. He isn't who they think he is. His voice was low, almost lost beneath the orchestra, but I heard every word. A shiver ran down my spine. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but he pressed my hand tighter, his expression a warning. Not now. So I sat there in the dim glow, the music rising, the applause echoing, and for the first time that night I felt something stronger than humiliation. I felt fear. And when Jason turned his head, his eyes meeting Daniel's across the room, for the briefest moment I knew Daniel wasn't just imagining things. His stare was returned sharp and assessing, like two men, recognizing each other in a way no one else could see. The ballroom glittered like a palace from another century. Golden chandeliers dripped with light above 200 guests, their reflections scattered across mirrored walls and polished marble floors. Tall arrangements of white roses and lilies towered over each table, while servers in crisp uniforms floated through the aisles carrying silver trays of champagne. Every corner sparkled, every detail whispered wealth and importance, and for a moment I wondered how I had even walked through those doors without being turned away. Emily moved through the crowd like it was built for her. The lace of her gown shimmered under the lights, each bead carefully stitched to catch attention, each step measured and graceful. Her veil trailed behind her like a silk river, and every guest seemed eager to step into her orbit. She smiled and laughed as if her whole life had led her to this stage, and maybe it had. My mother Margaret stood near the head table, glowing with pride, one hand pressed delicately to her pearls, the other clapping for her daughter. She whispered to anyone within reach about Emily's beauty, Jason's power, and how the Millers and Langfords were now connected forever. My father Richard lingered beside her, his smile polite, his shoulders a little too stiff, as if he knew how fragile the image was, but dared not crack it. I sat at my lonely table by the fire exit, staring at my name card, trying to ignore the chill of being forgotten. The music rose, violins weaving through the air, and laughter filled the space. The scent of roses and champagne drifted around me, but none of it touched my corner. A coat rack leaned behind me, reminding me of where I stood in the order of things. I saw Aunt Carol making her way past, her dress simple compared to the sequin gowns around her, but her eyes warm and direct. She leaned down as if adjusting her shoe and whispered, "I always knew this was unfair to you, Rachel. Always." Then she straightened, gave me a soft pat on the shoulder, and walked away before anyone could notice. The words stayed with me, sharp and comforting all at once. She had noticed. Someone had seen what I had felt all my life. But I didn't have time to let the warmth sink in because Daniel shifted in his chair beside me. His gaze hadn't left Jason. The groom was laughing with a city councilman, now gesturing broadly with his glass, his phone still clutched in his other hand. His smile was too polished, too practiced. Daniel leaned close, his voice low enough that it barely cut through the swell of music. "Jason Langford isn't the businessman they think he is." The words chilled me. I turned my head to him, searching his face for any hint of doubt, but there was none. His jaw was firm, his eyes cold. He wasn't speculating. He was certain. I looked back at Jason, standing tall with Emily's hand looped through his arm, his tuxedo immaculate, his family gathered proudly at his side. The Langfords were old Boston money owners of construction firms that built half the skyline, their name etched into universities and charity halls. To the guests in that room, Jason was the definition of legacy. But Daniel's tone cut through the illusion. Not a businessman, not who they think he is. I pressed my palms against my lap, my mind racing. I wanted to ask how he knew what he meant, what Jason truly was, but the words caught in my throat. Around us, the guests raised their glasses again, oblivious to the storm building and Daniel's silence. My mother was laughing with the mayor's wife. Emily was radiant under the lights, and Jason's smile never faltered. The orchestra shifted to a softer melody, and the chatter dimmed slightly as servers lit candles at each table. The glow spread through the room, gilding every detail, making the entire ballroom look like it had been dipped in gold. I sat in the shadows, Daniel's words echoing louder than the music, and tried to steady my breathing. I thought about what Aunt Carol had said, how unfair it had always been, and I realized tonight was not just about being overlooked again. It was about something much bigger, something dangerous. Jason laughed again, too loudly this time, his hand tightening on Emily's waist as he scanned the crowd. For a moment, his eyes swept toward the back of the room, toward the fire exit, toward me. And though it lasted only a second, I felt the weight of his glance like a warning. I turned back to Daniel, but he didn't move. His stare was locked, sharp and steady, as if he were already preparing for what no one else in the room could imagine. And in that moment, with the music swelling and the candles flickering, I felt the ground shift beneath me. This wasn't just a wedding. This was the opening act of something that could tear everything apart. Jason's charm began to unravel the longer I kept my eyes on him. At first, it was small things, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. He checked his watch too often, lifting his wrist in sharp movements as if every passing minute carried weight. His phone was never out of his grip. Even when someone clapped him on the back or leaned in for a congratulatory handshake, his thumb kept gliding across the screen, his jaw tightening each time the device buzzed. Emily glowed beside him, soaking in the admiration of the guests. She laughed easily, her cheeks flushed from champagne, her fingers curled around his arm like she had just won a prize. I wondered if she noticed how stiff he was, how his eyes darted toward the exits instead of lingering on her. Or maybe she had spent her whole life learning to ignore things that didn't fit the picture she wanted the world to see. The string quartet moved into a softer melody, and the ballroom seemed to melt in golden candlelight. Guests swayed on the dance floor, their silk gowns brushing against polished shoes, their laughter ringing out above the music. It looked perfect from a distance, but the tension at the center of the room was becoming impossible to ignore. Daniel shifted beside me, his body angled toward Jason. His expression didn't change, but I felt the way his grip on my hand tightened. When his phone vibrated quietly under the table, he slipped it out with the kind of practiced movement that made me realize just how often he'd done this before. The screen lit briefly, and I caught a glimpse of the message before he dimmed it. Target confirmed. Be ready. My chest clenched. I turned to him quickly, but he had already slipped the phone back into his jacket. His face was calm, his eyes steady, but there was a sharpness in his silence that unsettled me. "What does that mean?" I whispered. "Not here," he murmured, his gaze never leaving Jason. I leaned back, my pulse racing in my ears. All around us, guests clinked glasses and laughed, oblivious to the shift that had just happened under their noses. My parents glowed at the head table, the Langfords nodded proudly, and Emily sparkled in her lace gown. No one saw what I saw. No one felt the tremor under the floor. A light touch on my shoulder startled me, and I turned to see Samantha Brooks crouching beside me. She wore a burgundy dress that set off her auburn hair, and her expression carried that mix of warmth and sharp intuition that had drawn me to her in college. "You look pale," she whispered, searching my face. "Are you all right?" I forced a thin smile. "I'm fine. Just a long day." Her eyes narrowed. "Rachel, you don't look fine." I squeezed her hand quickly, hoping to reassure her. "Go dance, Sam. don't worry about me." She studied me for a moment longer before sighing softly. "I'll check on you later." When she drifted back into the crowd, I felt the familiar ache of guilt. Samantha had always been the one who tried to pull me out of the shadows, but tonight I couldn't risk dragging her into whatever storm was brewing. Jason moved, then excusing himself from a conversation with a councilman and slipping toward the edge of the ballroom. He pressed his phone to his ear as he walked, his shoulders rigid, his steps quick. I watched him disappear into a side hallway, the mask of charm slipping from his face the second he thought no one was watching. His jaw set hard, his brows furrowed, his eyes sharp and restless. For a moment he paused in the corridor, turning just enough for me to catch his expression. Gone was the polished smile. In its place was something colder, more calculating, the look of a man cornered. Daniel noticed too. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, his body tense but his face controlled. "Stay here," he said quietly, the authority in his voice, leaving no room for argument. My throat tightened. "What's happening, Daniel?" His eyes didn't move from the hallway. "Nothing you need to worry about." But the words rang hollow, and we both knew it. The music in the ballroom swelled again, covering the faint hum of Jason's voice drifting back from the corridor. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clipped, urgent. His free hand clenched into a fist at his side, then loosened, then clenched again. He looked like a man negotiating something far bigger than wedding toasts and champagne flutes. Emily glanced around the room, once her smile faltering for just a second when she didn't spot her new husband. She smoothed her gown, lifted her chin, and turned back to her friends with another laugh, as if pretending hard enough would keep the cracks from showing. I sat frozen, every nerve on edge, the air around me heavier with each passing second. The chandeliers glittered, the candles flickered, the guests laughed and toasted, but all I could see was Jason's shadow shifting in the hallway, his voice low and clipped, his eyes darting like a man watching the clock run down. When he finally ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket, his expression hardened even more. For the briefest second, he glanced back into the ballroom, his gaze sweeping across the crowd until it landed on me. Our eyes met, and though it lasted no longer than a heartbeat, I felt the chill of recognition. He knew he was being watched. Then he turned sharply and walked further down the corridor, his steps swallowed by the hum of the music. Daniel's hand rested firm on my arm, grounding me. His stare stayed fixed on the hallway, his jaw tight, his body poised like a man, waiting for a signal only he could hear. And all I could think was how fragile this glittering night suddenly seemed, how quickly it could all shatter, and how powerless I felt watching the cracks widen. The music inside the ballroom carried on like nothing was wrong, but my mind was already pulling me backward, back to the week before, when we all gathered around my parents' dining table in Newton. The oak table gleamed with polished silverware, the china plates set out with care, though the meal itself was simple. It wasn't about food that night. It was about Emily. She sat at the center of attention, her left hand raised, as if she were modeling for a magazine, the diamond on her finger, catching every bit of light from the chandelier above. A stone that size could have paid off my student loans and still had money left to spare. She basked in the glow of it, her smile soft, practiced, and designed to dazzle. "This," she announced, "is just the beginning. Jason says after the wedding we'll start looking at properties in Back Bay. Something historic, something with character." My mother, Margaret, gasped like she had been handed a crown of her own. "You deserve nothing less, Emily. Truly, you've brought such honor to this family." My father, Richard, gave one of his stiff smiles, the kind he wore when he was at business dinners, and wanted to appear agreeable. He nodded toward Jason's name as though just saying it carried weight. "You made the right choice. Stability. Ambition." I pressed my fork into a roasted carrot, the sweetness lost on my tongue. I kept my eyes lowered, knowing what was coming, and sure enough, my mother turned to me, her pearls glinting against her sweater. "Rachel, if only you had aimed higher, if only you had Emily's drive. We would not have spent so many years worrying. Look at your sister. She's proof that discipline and ambition are rewarded." The sting of her words was familiar, but it still hurt. I wanted to defend myself, to remind her that my job in marketing paid my bills, that I had built a life without their help, that success didn't always look like diamonds and lace. But silence was safer, and silence was what I gave them. Emily smirked faintly, already absorbed again in her phone, scrolling through messages from friends and designers. Dinner ended as it usually did. My parents' glowing, Emily triumphant me fading into the wallpaper. I drove home that night with my teeth clenched, my chest tight, wondering why I still let their words dig so deep. Later, when Daniel came through my apartment door, the clock nearly struck midnight. Snow clung to his coat, his eyes were tired, and in his hand was a folder thick with papers. He set it quickly on the shelf, almost too quickly, as though it carried secrets he couldn't risk me seeing. "Long night," he said, his voice steady but worn. I wanted to ask what was inside, why his phone vibrated at odd hours, why his eyes carried shadows I didn't understand. But the words stayed behind my teeth. He pulled me into his arms, kissed the top of my head, and promised me everything was fine. I nodded, even though my gut told me it wasn't. Now, seated in the glittering ballroom, those memories clashed with the sight of Jason Langford slipping into the hallway. His phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight-clipped. I strained to catch fragments over the music and chatter, and then I heard it clear and unmistakable. Shipment. The word sliced through me like ice water. It didn't belong here, not in a place filled with champagne and roses. Shipment was a word Daniel had used once when he thought I was asleep, murmuring into his phone about movements, about keeping something contained. I had chalked it up to government jargon I wasn't supposed to understand. Hearing it now in Jason's voice made my stomach lurch. I leaned slightly closer to Daniel, my lips barely moving. "Did you hear that?" His jaw tightened, but his eyes never left the hallway. Emily still laughed among her friends, blissfully unaware her groom was whispering about shipments instead of vows. My parents clinked glasses with the Langfords, their smiles wide and proud. The orchestra swelled, drowning out the world, but I couldn't unhear that one word, shipment. The sound of it confirmed what Daniel had been hinting at all along. This wasn't nerves. This wasn't stage fright. Jason wasn't who he claimed to be. I folded my hands tightly in my lap, the memory of my mother's voice echoing in my head. If only you had been like Emily. If only you had aimed higher. And here, Emily was standing beside a man who spoke of shipments in the shadows, while the world toasted their union. The irony almost made me laugh, but the knot in my chest was too heavy. I stared into the candlelight flickering at the nearest table, the scent of roses cloying in the air, and realized I had crossed a line inside myself. For the first time, I believed Daniel completely. I turned my head toward Daniel, my voice almost swallowed by the laughter and clinking glasses around us. I should warn my parents. If they knew what Jason really was, maybe they could stop this before it got worse. Daniel's grip tightened on my hand, steady but firm, his eyes, never leaving the hallway where Jason had disappeared. Don't. They won't believe you. To them you'll sound jealous, like you're trying to ruin her wedding. The words stung because they were true. My whole life, every time I pointed out something wrong, it was twisted into envy. When Emily dated a boy who openly cheated, I told her she deserved better. She screamed that I was bitter. When she came home from college bragging about friends who used her for her money, I tried to warn her. My mother scolded me for trying to take her joy. Even when she announced her engagement to Jason after knowing him less than a year, I asked if she was sure. She told everyone I was jealous and couldn't stand her happiness. So I sat there, heart pounding, knowing Daniel was right. If I walked across that ballroom and told them the truth, my mother would sneer, my father would go silent, and Emily would smirk like she always did. They would never listen. Daniel's voice was low but sharp. "Rachel, listen to me. Jason Langford isn't a businessman. He has been on our radar for over 2 years. I froze, staring at him, trying to process what he had just said. Our radar. 2 years. Daniel's jaw tightened. International warrants. Fraud. Smuggling. Arms trafficking. He's not just a liar, Rachel. He is dangerous. The air around me seemed to vanish. Jason, the polished groom with the perfect tuxedo, the one my family had celebrated for months, wasn't nervous about speeches or dances. He was nervous because the FBI had been watching him. My voice cracked as I whispered, "You're serious?" Daniel nodded once firm. We've tracked him across borders, across accounts, across deals. Tonight we confirm what we already know. He thought marrying into a Boston family with social ties would shield him. It won't. I pressed my trembling hands together in my lap, trying to steady myself. I looked at Emily across the room, glowing in her lace gown, her veil trailing like a dream behind her. She laughed with her friends, her ring flashing as she raised her glass. She had no idea the man she had just tied her life to was the same man Daniel described. I thought of the warnings I had given her before, the ones that turned into arguments. In high school, when her best friend was caught stealing from her locker, I told her to let the girl go. She screamed that I wanted her alone. In college, when her boyfriend bragged about cheating, I begged her to leave. She accused me of being unable to handle her happiness. Last year, when Jason came into the picture with his fast smiles and vague answers, I asked if she knew anything about his past. She called me bitter in front of our mother. Now I knew. I had been right all along, but no one would ever admit it. Daniel's voice broke through my thoughts, steady, controlled. This isn't just about Emily. If he senses anything, if he realizes we're here, this room could turn in seconds. I glanced around at the 200 guests, their glasses raised high, their laughter echoing under the chandeliers. My parents sat proudly at the head table, their faces glowing with approval, blind to the truth looming over them. Aunt Carol smiled politely to neighbors, her eyes occasionally flicking toward me with quiet sympathy. And Emily stood at the center of it all, her gown glittering, her joy untouched. I wanted to stand and shout it across the room to tell them their perfect night was a lie. But Daniel's hand pressed on mine again, grounding me. His whisper carried a warning. If you speak now, he'll know we're onto him. You'll put everyone in danger. Danger. The word chilled me more than the air drifting from the fire exit behind me. I watched Jason reappear in the corridor, phone still in hand, his expression hard. I couldn't hear everything he said, but one word carried back clear enough to slice through the music. Shipment. I stiffened. Daniel's eyes flicked to mine sharp, and for the first time I didn't need him to explain. Jason wasn't talking about wedding gifts or deliveries. It was the kind of word Daniel used when he thought I was asleep, murmuring into his phone about intercepted cargo or coordinated movements. Emily's laughter rang out again across the ballroom, the sound jarring against the reality pressing in on me. I wrapped my arms around myself and shivered. All those years my family told me I was jealous, that I only wanted to tear her down. But the truth was right in front of us, dressed in a tuxedo, hiding crimes behind a smile. I stared at the chandeliers, at the glittering glasses, at the roses spilling from their vases, and I understood with a sick clarity. This was not a wedding anymore. It was a powder keg. One wrong move, and the celebration my parents had built their pride on could become a battlefield. The clinking of silverware quieted as Robert Langford rose from his seat at the head table. He was a tall man with a voice built for podiums, not weddings. The room hushed the moment he tapped his glass, the strings fading into silence, all 200 guests turning toward him. Tonight, he declared, we celebrate not just the union of two people, but the joining of two legacies. The Langford family is honored to welcome Emily into our circle, and we are grateful for the Millers who raised such a remarkable young woman. Applause swelled polite and practiced bouncing off the mirrored walls. My mother Margaret glowed as though the speech were written for her alone. She sat straighter in her chair, pearls gleaming under the lights, her hand resting delicately on the stem of her champagne glass. She leaned forward slightly, catching my eye across the room. The smile she gave me was small, sharp, almost imperceptible to anyone else. It wasn't a smile of pride. It was triumph, the kind that said, "See, Emily is everything you could never be." My chest tightened. I forced my gaze back to Robert, his words pouring out like a sermon full of gratitude, honor, legacy. But all I could hear were the whispers beginning to spread among the tables. Poor Rachel. Sitting all the way in the back. Did they even put her on the guest list properly? She looks like she doesn't belong here. The words drifted in fragments, carried on champagne bubbles and soft laughter. My cheeks burned, though I had learned long ago how to keep my expression still. I traced the rim of my empty glass, watching the golden chandeliers blur as tears pressed at the corners of my eyes. Robert lifted his glass high. To Jason and Emily, may their future be as bright as the room we stand in tonight. The toast was met with cheers and clinking glasses. My mother laughed too loudly, her hand brushing Emily's arm, her eyes still cutting back to me with that smug satisfaction. My father Richard smiled thinly, nodding along as though agreeing with every word. I sat in silence, invisible, while my sister basked in the glow of 100 admiring eyes. Then Daniel shifted beside me. His hand brushed against my arm, steadying me, pulling me back from the fog of humiliation. I turned toward him, ready to whisper something, anything but the movement he made stopped my breath. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his jacket. His fingers slipped into the inner pocket, and for just a moment he tilted the fabric open far enough for me to see the leather badge holder resting against his chest. The gleam of gold and the unmistakable letters seared into my vision. FBI. I froze. The air seemed to vanish from my lungs. Every suspicion, every late-night call, every vague explanation suddenly locked into place. The man sitting beside me, the one who had chosen me when no one else did, wasn't just a government employee with a secretive job. He was an agent. And he was here for Jason. Daniel closed his jacket, calmly, his face betraying nothing. His hand covered mine once more, his voice low enough that it barely reached me. Now you understand. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but the weight of what I had just seen pinned me silent. Around us guests cheered, the orchestra struck up another melody, and Emily's laughter rang across the ballroom. None of them knew the truth, sitting quietly at my side. I glanced back at Jason. He had returned from the hallway, slipping seamlessly into the glow of the ballroom again. He raised his glass, his smile polished his voice, booming with gratitude as he thanked the guests for their presence. But his eyes, even as they scanned the room with warmth, darted quickly toward the exits, toward the shadows, where Daniel's focus never wavered. The roses on the tables gleamed in the candlelight, the crystal glasses sparkled, and the air smelled of champagne and wealth. But beneath it all, I felt the tremor of something darker, something ready to break through the surface. I sat perfectly still, Daniel's steady hand grounding me, my mind reeling with the truth that had just been revealed. The man my sister had married was not who he seemed. And the man I had chosen to love was not who I thought he was either. For the first time, the lines of family loyalty and truth blurred into one chilling certainty. This night would not end the way anyone expected. The glitter of the chandeliers washed over the ballroom, disguising the tension that was crawling beneath the surface. Guests clapped politely at another long-winded toast, their voices rising with laughter that felt rehearsed, practiced, hollow. The orchestra played on violins, sweeping sweetly, as though this was the safest place in the world. But my stomach knew better. Something in the air had shifted, brittle and sharp, ready to break. The microphone drifted closer, passed between manicured hands and polished smiles. Compliments about Jason's charm, Emily's beauty, the blending of two remarkable families. Each word piled like frosting on a cake, already too sweet, already hiding something rotten inside. My fingers dug into my lap, my eyes darting to Daniel. He was still watchful, his jaw set. Then the microphone reached him. Daniel rose, and the sound of his chair scraping across marble cracked through the noise. Heads turned curious, expectant. They thought they were about to hear another neat little speech. Maybe something sentimental from the quiet fiancé at the back. Instead, his voice rang out clear, steady, and final. Jason Langford. The room froze. You are under arrest. It was like the chandeliers above shattered without breaking. Gasps tore through the air, a woman screamed, a glass hit the floor with a crash. The orchestra stopped mid-note, their bows suspended in mid-air. Jason's smile faltered, his champagne flute tipping in his hand. His eyes darted to Daniel, then to the doors, then back, his lips pressed tight. And then the side doors flew open. Agents surged in dark suits, weapons raised, voices booming with authority. FBI, step away. Hands where we can see them. Clear the area now. Chaos erupted. Guests shrieked, chairs toppled, gowns swished against the carpet as people stumbled toward exits. Waiters dropped silver trays, champagne flooding the floor. The orderly, glittering celebration dissolved in seconds into pure panic. Jason froze, then moved. The glass fell from his hand and shattered, and his arm shot under his jacket. I saw the glint before my brain caught up. A gun. The ballroom erupted with shouted commands. "Drop it! Drop the weapon! Now!" Jason raised his arm, his face twisted with something raw and dangerous. His hand shook, but the gun was steady enough as he leveled it at the agents closing in. His chest-heaved sweat slicked his forehead, his polished groom's mask gone. In his place stood a cornered criminal. Emily's scream split the air. "Jason, please." She lurched forward, her veil trailing her gown heavy and awkward as she stumbled. Her bouquet slipped from her hand, roses scattering across the carpet. Her voice cracked. "Put it down. Jason, it's me." He didn't move. His eyes flicked toward her, soft for a fraction of a second, but his grip didn't loosen. Margaret shrieked and clawed at Richard's arm. My father's face was stone, his mouth open but useless. Guests shoved past them, frantic, some ducking under tables, others pressing against mirrored walls. A tray of crystal stemware fell, and shattered, the sound sharp as gunfire. Emily reached him her hand, brushing his sleeve, tears streaking her face. "Jason, don't. Stop this." For the briefest heartbeat he seemed to falter. Then her body gave way. Her knees buckled. She collapsed into the carpet, the satin of her dress billowing as she fell. Her veil tangled her bouquet, crushed beneath rushing feet. Gasps rippled across the ballroom. The bride lay motionless, her white gown spread like a wilted rose. Margaret screamed Emily's name, a sound more primal than I had ever heard from her. She tried to run forward, but Richard's arm held her frozen in place. My father's eyes were wide, his face ashen, the pride drained out of him. Jason stared down at Emily, his mask cracking into horror for just an instant. His lips parted like he might speak, but instead his hand jerked higher, the gun swinging back toward the agents who had fanned out around him. Daniel stepped forward, his voice ringing with authority I had never heard before. "Jason Langford. Drop the weapon, now." The ballroom glittered around us like some cruel stage set. Roses spilled from toppled vases, champagne dripped into the carpet, the scent of fear sharp as smoke. Guests crouched, sobbed, whispered frantic prayers. And in the center, Jason stood armed. My sister lay collapsed, my parents broken, and Daniel's calm voice cut through it all. The night my family had wanted to be perfect had already shattered. The only question was how far it would fall before it ended. The ballroom exploded into chaos. Screams overlapped chairs, toppled glasses shattered across the marble floor, and the chandeliers above swayed with the stampede of 200 frantic guests. The music had died, but the echo of fear was deafening. Agents shouted commands, their weapons trained on Jason, their movements swift and coordinated. Guests shoved one another in their rush to escape, gowns tangling tuxedos, ripped children crying. The scent of champagne and roses mixed with sweat and terror. Jason fired. The crack of the gunshot split the room, sending people diving under tables and crawling across the floor. The bullet buried itself in a wall of mirrors, spraying shards across the crowd. A woman screamed as glass rained down over her sequined dress. The agents advanced, forming a line, their voices cutting through the panic. "Drop it, Jason. Put the gun down now." But Jason was wild-eyed, his chest heaving, his voice hoarse with fury. "Stay back! Stay away from me!" Emily lay on the floor, her gown spread around her like broken wings, her mother wailing beside her. Margaret's hands trembled as she tried to lift her daughter's veil, her pearls snapping loose from her neck and scattering across the carpet. Richard finally found his voice raw and broken. "My God, what is happening to my family?" His shout carried above the chaos, but it was drowned quickly by another round of gunfire. Jason pulled the trigger again, sending agents diving behind overturned tables. Sparks flew from a chandelier chain, the light flickering as the crystal fixture rattled above. Guests trampled over roses and broken glass as they fought to push through the side exits. Daniel was beside me, steady and sharp, his hand gripping my arm. "Stay down, Rachel. Stay with me." His body shielded mine as the crowd surged, people clawing for space, their panic suffocating. A waiter stumbled into us, his white jacket streaked with blood from a cut on his arm, his tray bent underfoot. Jason staggered backward as the agents closed in his gun, hand trembling but still raised. The polished groom in a designer tuxedo had vanished, replaced by a hunted man desperate to carve his way out. He backed toward the side of the ballroom, firing another shot that shattered a vase and sent crimson roses spilling across the floor like blood. The agents fanned out, circling their voices calm but urgent. "Drop it, Jason. There's no way out." Jason's eyes flickered toward the far hallway. He saw what they all saw, a service door slightly ajar, the only exit not yet sealed. Daniel cursed under his breath, his hand pressing me closer against the wall as the crush of fleeing guests surged past. People screamed and shoved, their polished elegance shredded by raw survival. A child cried for her mother. A man tripped and was dragged up by another guest, their cufflinks and gowns forgotten in the rush. Jason fired again, the bullet sparking against a silver tray that clattered to the ground. The agents ducked, then moved tighter, their steps coordinated, forcing him backward inch by inch. But Jason fought like a cornered animal, his eyes burning with defiance. Margaret sobbed louder, clutching Emily's limp hand, while Richard swayed beside them, his face ghostly. His voice cracked again, louder this time, torn from deep inside. "My God, what has he brought into our lives?" No one answered him. The answer was written across the chaos, across the toppled tables, and shattered crystal, across the collapsed bride and the armed groom fighting against justice. Jason's back hit the wall near the service corridor. He turned sharply, firing once more, and the agents ducked, their voices surging. Go block the exit." But he was faster. With one last burst of desperate strength, Jason shoved a table aside and lunged for the narrow hall. The crowd screamed again, bodies colliding, as people tried to press themselves farther from his path. The chandeliers swung violently now, their crystals rattling like teeth, the entire ballroom trembling under the weight of panic. Daniel shoved me behind him, his frame unyielding, as a guest slammed against my shoulder in the rush. "Stay with me," he ordered, his voice low and unshaken even as chaos clawed at us. I looked past him in time to see Jason disappear into the dark hallway, his figure swallowed by the shadows, leaving behind the wreckage of the ballroom. The room he abandoned was no longer a wedding. It was ruin. Roses lay, crushed pearls scattered like tears, champagne soaking the floor. Emily lay pale and motionless, her mother's sobs breaking through the noise. My father stood with his hands gripping his head, his eyes hollow, whispering to no one, to everyone, to himself. What happened to us? And still the echoes of Jason's gunfire rang in my ears even after he was gone. The marble lobby echoed with the heavy thud of boots as agents chased Jason beyond the ballroom. The shouts grew louder, sharp commands cutting through the air, followed by the scrape of bodies colliding. Guests pressed against the walls, their eyes wide, some crying, some recording on their phones despite the chaos. My breath caught in my throat as I clung to Daniel's arm, watching the night unravel in ways I never thought possible. It didn't take long. Jason reappeared, dragged by two agents, his wrists cuffed tightly behind his back. His tuxedo jacket was ripped, his hair disheveled, his face twisted with rage. He shouted words that made no sense, threats and denials tumbling from his mouth, but no one was listening. His gun was gone. His power drained, his mask of wealth and perfection shattered. The FBI shoved him toward the entrance, cameras flashing like lightning as news crews already swarmed outside the hotel. The wedding was finished. What remained was ruin. Inside, the guests began filing out, some whispering as they clutched their coats, others rushing for the elevators with their children in tow. The clink of broken glass under their shoes, the faint sobs of women, the murmur of disbelief carried like a wave. Waiters stood frozen near overturned trays, helpless in the wreckage. Emily had not moved from the spot where she collapsed. She sat slumped on the floor, her gown bunched around her legs, her veil hanging limp across her shoulder. Mascara streaked her cheeks, her hands limp at her sides, her eyes glazed over like she was staring through the walls themselves. The bride, who had been radiant hours ago, now looked like her life had ended in front of everyone she ever wanted to impress. Margaret crouched beside her, clutching her daughter's face in trembling hands. Her perfect pearls had snapped earlier beads scattering across the carpet like little white lies, and she didn't even notice. She sobbed openly, her body racked with guilt. Her voice broke as she whispered again and again. "Why didn't we listen to Rachel? Why didn't we hear her?" Richard stood a few feet away, pale, hollow, his hands dangling uselessly at his sides. His mouth opened, but no sound came. When at last he did speak, his voice cracked so violently that it startled those around him. "What happened to my family? My God, what happened to us?" He looked at me then, his eyes full of shame before dropping his gaze to the ruined carpet. The chaos inside was bad enough, but the storm outside was worse. Through the tall glass doors, I saw lights flashing, red and blue cameras stacked shoulder to shoulder, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Reporters shouted questions over one another, their words muffled but urgent. The Miller name was already leaving the ballroom, carried by headlines that would spread within minutes. An agent in a crisp suit stepped to the center of the room, his voice clear and unflinching. "Jason Langford has been taken into custody. He is facing charges of money laundering, international arms trafficking, and conspiracy. The investigation has been ongoing since 2021. His words landed like blows, each one heavier than the last. The whispers began immediately. Arms trafficking, money laundering, under investigation for years. People muttered prayers, curses, disbelief. One woman in a sequined dress covered her mouth and shook her head. A man near the back scoffed and said he knew the Langfords were too good to be true. Robert Langford's face was ashen. He stood apart from everyone, his jaw set so tightly the muscles trembled. His eyes burned with humiliation as he listened to the charges being read aloud. Then, with a curt motion to his assistant, he turned. His voice was sharp, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. "This marriage is finished. The Langford family severs all ties with the Millers immediately." Gasps swept through the room. Margaret's sob turned into a howl, and Emily shook her head weakly, trying to rise, but falling back against her mother's arms. Richard swayed where he stood, his shoulders slumping, as if the words had struck him physically. Robert did not pause. His security team parted the crowd, leading him toward the exit. Outside, the reporters surged, lights flashing wildly as microphones reached for his face. He didn't look back. He left the Miller family to the wolves. Neighbors, family, friends, distant relatives who had come to celebrate now exchanged sharp glances and muttered judgments. A woman whispered that the Millers were finished, that no one respectable would ever invite them again. A man in a navy suit told his wife that their name was ruined beyond repair. Every word was a lash against Margaret and Richard, who stood hollow in the middle of it all. Emily wept quietly, her hands trembling as she clutched at her ruined dress. Margaret pressed her face into her daughter's shoulder, her sobs raw, while Richard pressed his palms against his forehead and refused to lift his eyes. The pillars of pride that had once made them untouchable now crumbled in public view. I stood apart, Daniel steady beside me, his hand anchoring me in the storm. I could feel eyes turning toward me, some curious, some pitying, some finally realizing the irony. For years they had made me the shadow, the invisible one, the sister to be dismissed. And now the spotlight that once belonged to Emily burned the Millers to ash. The ballroom that had glowed with gold and roses just hours earlier was now a graveyard of broken glass and whispered disgrace. Guests slipped out quietly, their stares sharp, their murmurs cruel. The Miller family name was gone, shredded under the weight of truth and the merciless eye of the public. And for the first time, I felt the burden lift. We did not sleep. Hotel staff moved through the wreckage with quiet efficiency, sweeping glass writing chairs, collecting abandoned shoes and crumpled programs. Sirens faded and returned, then faded again. The string quartet cases were closed like coffins on the far side of the room. By the time paramedics cleared Emily and said she could go home with family, the chandeliers had stopped trembling, and the scent of roses was faint under the heavier smell of bleach. I sat on the edge of a chair that had survived the panic and watched my sister stare at a single thread on her gown. She tugged at it absent-mindedly, until it snapped. Mascara traced gray rivers along her cheeks. Margaret bent beside her, murmuring fragments that never formed into sentences. Richard stood a half step away, rubbing his temples, as if he could erase the night with the heel of his hand. No one mentioned the name Langford. It hung in the air like smoke. Near the lobby doors, reporters still pressed against the line of agents who refused them entry. Camera flashes sparked with every movement, as if the hotel itself had become a lightning rod. Someone slid a copy of an early edition across the concierge desk. The headline bled across the front page with cruel precision. FBI arrests international fugitive at lavish Boston wedding. A smaller line beneath it named the Beacon Grand and featured a blurred photo of Jason in cuffs. I did not look away. I wanted the truth, in ink heavy and undeniable, something my mother could not edit and my father could not silence. Daniel returned from speaking with a supervisor and took the seat beside me. He looked tired but steady, his presence, a fixed point in a room that had tilted and refused to right itself. He did not offer empty reassurance. He did not hide behind easy words. He placed his hand over mine and let the quiet say what needed saying. We were safe. The worst had already happened. The rest would be aftermath. Emily tried to stand and failed. Margaret gathered the folds of satin and eased her back down. The pearls that had snapped earlier kept turning up underfoot and in the hems of tablecloths. Margaret brushed one from the crease of Emily's palm and stared at it like a strange seed that would never grow. When she lifted her eyes to me, something in them had softened, not pity and not pride, but recognition. She swallowed and looked away. The apology did not come, not yet, but the shape of it existed between us. Richard drifted closer, his shoulders bowed. He cleared his throat and then cleared it again, as if sound could not find the path. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin. I thought I was protecting this family. He stopped there, unable to go further. The sentence sat unfinished, but I did not need the rest. The man who preferred silence had met the one thing it could not contain. An agent approached with paperwork for statements. Daniel handled most of it, answering in the careful cadence I had come to recognize as his professional voice. I added what I had seen and what I had heard, the word shipment, the look in Jason's eyes when he scanned the exit. Writing it down made it real in a way the chaos had not. Ink pinned it to time. Outside, the sky paled toward morning. The reporters did not thin, they multiplied. More headlines would follow by breakfast. By noon, there would be talk radio segments and op-eds and neighbors pretending they had always known. Karma does not ask for permission. It simply arrives, sometimes late, sometimes with an audience. We finally rose to leave the ballroom. Staff held the door for us, their faces courteous and careful. Margaret took Emily's arm. Richard took Margaret's bag with a kind of clumsy reverence. We moved as a small procession through the lobby where floral arches looked absurd, now stray petals sticking to the soles of shoes. Near the revolving doors, Margaret stopped. She turned to me, not dramatic, not grand, just a woman who had run out of ways to pretend. Her voice was rough. I see it now. The years. You. We should have listened. She faltered and then gave a single small nod, as if signing a document that had been in front of her all along. It was not absolution, but it was a beginning. I returned the nod and did not push for more. I had learned the hard way that a seed needs quiet to root. We stepped into the dawn. Cold air washed the hotel's perfume from my skin. Sirens had stilled. Traffic whispered along Beacon Street. Across the road, newspaper stands already carried the story that would follow our family for years. I watched a passerby pause, read the headline, and shake his head before walking on. To him, it was a scandal. To us, it was a reckoning. Back in our room, Daniel loosened his tie and sat on the edge of the bed. I stood at the window, palms against cool glass, the city waking in slow bands of light. In the reflection, I saw us as we were. A woman who had spent her life learning to be quiet. A man who had spent his life keeping dangerous truths until the minute it mattered. I turned and sat beside him. He took my hand again, that simple gesture that had carried me across more nights than I could count. I did not need to raise my voice or list my wounds. I did not have to gather witnesses. The truth had stood in the center of a ballroom and spoken for itself. For the first time, I did not feel the urge to convince anyone of who I was. I felt steady in my own shape. We checked out after sunrise. The lobby was calmer, though staff still moved with the purposeful energy of cleanup. A bellhop avoided a crushed rose, the last bloom to hold its color through the night. Margaret and Richard waited near the car valet. Emily wrapped in a wool coat, her veil gone, her hair pinned back in a practical twist. She did not meet my eyes, but when the driver opened the door, she paused and touched my sleeve with a tremor of pressure. "Thank you" would have been too simple for what stood between us. I squeezed her fingers and let them go. Daniel and I stepped onto the sidewalk. The air smelled like coffee and wet stone. He laced his fingers with mine, and I felt the steadiness again, not the rescue of a hero, but the partnership of someone who had seen me when it counted. I looked up at him and let the words come out plain, the only ones that felt honest after a night built on pretense. Justice doesn't always need revenge. Sometimes it just needs the truth. He smiled and we began to walk. The city opened in front of us like a map, newly drawn, familiar streets leading to places that would never look quite the same. I did not turn back to the hotel. The story inside would continue without me, lawyers and statements, and the long labor of repairing what could be repaired. My part was finished. I had finally stepped out of the shadow my family had cast, not by shouting, but by refusing to look away. By the time we reached the corner, sunlight had found the top windows of the Beacon Grand and set them alight. It was a clean light, indifferent to last night's performance. It warmed my face, and I lifted my chin to meet it. The weight I had carried for years felt lighter, not gone, but changed. Truth does that. It does not erase, it rearranges. Later, after coffee in silence and the first deep breath in hours, I thought about the people who would read the headlines and fill in their own blanks. Some would say the bride deserved pity. Some would say the family should have known. Some would say that a sister who stays quiet is complicit. They would all be partially right and entirely wrong. Families are messy. So is justice. What matters is who stands up when it counts, and who listens when the quiet voice refuses to vanish. If you have ever been the one tucked at the far table, if you have ever been the woman they edit out of the family photo, tell me what you would have done. Would you speak, or would you let the truth reveal itself the way it did for me? Share your story in the comments. I read them, every one, because the quiet voices find each other in the end. And if these stories give you strength, stay with me for the next one. There are more rooms like that ballroom, more masks waiting to drop, and more moments when truth will be enough.